The explosion tore through the cargo bay like an angry beast. David Reed felt the floor vanish beneath his feet as emergency alarms screamed through every corridor of the Meridian Trader. He grabbed onto a support beam, but the metal was already twisting, already failing. Around him, crates broke free from their restraints and tumbled through the air. Somewhere in the chaos, someone was shouting evacuation orders. His hands found the emergency handle almost by instinct. The escape pod door hissed open and David threw himself inside. 3 figures tumbled in behind him, their bodies colliding with his in the cramped space. The door sealed automatically. Through the small window, David watched the trading vessel tear itself apart in silence, the void swallowing every sound. "Strap in," David said, reaching for the harness above his seat. His voice was steady despite the way his heart hammered against his ribs. The pod's engine fired without warning, throwing them away from the dying ship. G-forces pressed David back into his seat hard enough to make breathing difficult. The alien sitting across from him looked like living crystal. Quartz, David remembered from the crew manifest. The Velen's transparent body reflected the emergency lights in strange patterns. Next to Quartz sat Chirik, an insectoid trill whose compound eyes seemed to look in every direction at once. The third passenger was Scale, a reptilian shard whose green skin had gone pale with fear. "Where are we going?" Chirik's voice came out high and rapid, like pieces of glass clicking together. The navigation system should have engaged automatically. David leaned forward to check the control panel. His stomach dropped. "It's fried. The explosion must have damaged the pod before we launched. Then we are dead." Scale's words were flat, final. "Without navigation, we cannot reach a safe zone. We're not dead yet," David said. He punched buttons on the console, trying to coax any kind of response from the damaged system. "There's a planet nearby. I saw it on the scans before the ship went down." "A planet?" Quartz's voice held a strange quality, like wind chimes in a storm. "What classification?" David hesitated. "Class 7. The pod went silent except for the hum of failing life support. Class 7 meant Deathworld. It meant a planet so hostile that most species wouldn't survive a day on the surface without full environmental protection. It meant gravity that could crush weaker species, atmospheres that could poison, predators that could kill with ease. "We should try for deep space," Chirik said. "Send a distress signal. Wait for rescue. We don't have enough oxygen for that." David pulled up what little data remained on the damaged computer. "Life support is failing. We have maybe 3 hours of air left. That planet is 30 minutes away. Then we die quickly in the crash or slowly in space." Scale's head lowered in what David recognized as a gesture of defeat. "There is no third option." "There's always a third option," David said. He reached for the manual controls, the kind most species never learned to use because their ships were fully automated. His hands moved across the panel with practiced confidence, adjusting their trajectory degree by degree. "I'm putting us down on that planet." "You are insane." Quartz's body seemed to shimmer with agitation. "Humans may come from a death world, but even you cannot survive a Class 7 without equipment." David didn't answer. He was too focused on the approach angle, on the way the planet's gravity was already pulling at their small pod. The descent started smooth, almost gentle. Then the atmosphere hit them like a wall. The pod shook so hard David's teeth rattled. Heat washed over the exterior hull, turning the windows orange with friction fire. "Hull temperature critical," the computer announced in a calm voice that didn't match the terror of the moment. "Impact in 90 seconds. David fought the controls, trying to slow their descent. The manual thrusters fired in short bursts, barely making a difference. Through the window, he could see green now. Jungle thick and endless. At least they wouldn't hit water or desert. 60 seconds to impact. The pod punched through the canopy layer. Massive trees blurred past the windows. David yanked on the control stick, forcing the nose up. The pod clipped a tree trunk, spinning them sideways. Another impact, another. The world became a confusion of green and brown and violent motion. 30 seconds. David found the emergency brake, a last resort system that deployed parachutes and reverse thrusters simultaneously. The pod screamed in protest. Everything that wasn't strapped down became a projectile. David felt something hit his shoulder hard enough to bring stars to his vision. 15 seconds. They hit the ground at an angle, plowing through undergrowth and soil. The pod rolled once, twice, then slammed to a stop against something solid. Metal groaned. Glass cracked. Then finally everything went still. David hung in his harness, breathing hard, Every part of his body hurt. Next to him, Chirik was making a clicking sound that might have been crying. Scale had his eyes closed, probably praying. Quartz's crystalline body had developed several new cracks that leaked a substance like liquid light. "Everyone alive?" David asked. 3 voices answered in the affirmative, though none sounded happy about it. David released his harness and dropped to what was now the floor. The pod had landed on its side. He made his way to the door release, having to climb over seats and debris. The mechanism fought him, bent from the impact. He put his shoulder into it, using weight and leverage until something gave with a pop. The door fell open. Heat and humidity rolled into the pod like a living thing. The air smelled of growing things and rich earth and something else, something wild and dangerous. David pulled himself through the opening and stood on the hull of the pod, looking out at the alien jungle that surrounded them. Behind him, he heard Quartz speak in a quiet voice filled with dread. "We are truly on a death world now." David jumped down to the ground, his boots sinking slightly into the soft earth. He turned to look at his 3 companions as they emerged slowly from the pod, their faces showing various expressions of despair and fear. "Don't worry," David said, surveying the clearing where they'd crashed. "I'll have us a proper shelter built before nightfall." The 3 aliens stared at him like he'd just spoken nonsense. David smiled and started walking toward the tree line. David crouched at the edge of the clearing, studying the jungle with the same attention most people gave to computer screens. His eyes moved from plant to plant, tree to tree, taking in details that would mean nothing to most galactic species. Behind him, the 3 aliens huddled near the damaged escape pod like children afraid of the dark. "This is madness." Quartz's voice carried across the small space. "The human cannot simply walk into an unknown ecosystem without protection." "He already is," Scale pointed out. The reptilian had moved to the pod's doorway, watching David with something between horror and fascination. "Look at him. He acts like this is normal." David ignored their conversation. He'd found what he was looking for. A cluster of plants with broad leaves and thick stems. He approached slowly, not touching anything yet. On Earth, rushing into unknown vegetation was a good way to get poisoned. He assumed the same held true on alien worlds. The leaves were bigger than his torso, dark green on top and silver underneath. David looked for signs of danger, insects or thorns or discoloration that might mean toxins. When he found none, he touched one leaf very gently with the back of his hand. No burning sensation, no immediate reaction. He waited 30 seconds, then touched it with his palm. Still nothing. What is he doing? Chirik's clicking voice held notes of confusion. Why does he touch the plant so carefully? Testing, Scale said quietly. He is testing if it will harm him. David pulled a small knife from his belt, one of the few tools he'd had in his pocket when the ship exploded. He cut one of the stems near the base. White sap oozed out, but not aggressively. He waited again, watching to see if the plant released spores or gases. Nothing happened. Good. He moved to the next plant type, a vine that wrapped around a nearby tree trunk. The process repeated. Gentle touch, wait, firmer touch, wait, test cut. David worked his way around the clearing's edge for 20 minutes, cataloging plants not by name but by property. This one had strong fibers. That one had leaves that could shed water. Another had branches at perfect right angles for framework. I do not understand. Quartz had moved closer, though still maintaining a safe distance from the tree line. How does he know what to look for? He has no scanner, no database, no analysis equipment. Humans evolved on a death world, Scale reminded them. Perhaps they learned to survive without such things. David heard them talking but didn't respond. He'd found a tree with bark that peeled in long strips. He tested it, pulling gently. The bark came away clean, revealing pale wood underneath. The strips were flexible but strong, perfect for binding materials together. He began collecting them, coiling the bark strips over his shoulder like rope. His next discovery was a patch of clay-like mud near a small stream that cut through the jungle. David knelt and dug his fingers into it, testing the consistency. It held shape when squeezed but wasn't too sticky. Mixed with plant fiber, it would make decent insulation and waterproofing. He made a mental note of the location. He is gathering materials, Quartz observed. But for what purpose? The pod provides shelter. As if to answer a groan of stressed metal echoed across the clearing, they all turned to see the pod settling deeper into the ground, its damaged hull buckling under its own weight. One of the support struts gave way with a sharp crack. The pod is failing, David called out without looking back. It won't last more than a day or two. The crash damage was too severe. Then we wait for rescue inside while we can, Chirrut said. But the clicking sounds had lost their confidence. David finally turned to face them. Sweat ran down his face, but he wasn't breathing hard despite the planet's heavier gravity and thick air. Rescue isn't coming for at least 2 weeks. The distress beacon's range is limited. We need real shelter. 2 weeks? Chirrut's legs trembled. I cannot survive 2 weeks disconnected from the hive mind. The isolation will break me. You won't be isolated. David walked back toward them, his arms full of plant materials. You'll have us, and you'll have work to keep your mind busy. Work? Scale's head tilted in confusion. Building the shelter. David dropped his gathered materials in a pile near the pod. I'll need help. Not with the skilled parts, but with carrying and holding things. It'll keep you focused. Quartz made a sound like breaking glass. You truly intend to construct a dwelling using only materials from this hostile environment? Unless you've got a fabricator hidden somewhere, yes. David wiped sweat from his forehead. Humans have been building shelters for thousands of years. We did it long before we had advanced technology. We did it with our hands and whatever nature provided. But this is not Earth, Quartz said. You do not know these materials. You do not know their properties or structural integrity. David smiled. It wasn't a happy expression, but it wasn't worried either. Materials are materials. Wood is wood, even if it's alien wood. Leaves are leaves. What is mud? The principles don't change just because we're on a different planet. He started sorting his gathered materials into piles. Strong branches in one group, flexible vines in another, broad leaves in a third. His hands moved with confidence born from experience. From childhood summers spent in Earth's wilderness. From survival training that most humans took for granted. I need to make 3 more trips before I can start building, David said. While I'm gone, I need you 3 to collect stones. Flat ones about this size. He held his hands apart to show them. We'll need them for the foundation. Stones? Scale looked uncertain. Why stones? To keep the shelter floor off the ground. Prevents water damage and keeps insects out. David checked the sun's position in the sky. We have maybe 6 hours before dark. I'd rather not be working blind. Working blind. Chirrut repeated the phrase like it was foreign. You would continue even in darkness? If I have to. David started back toward the jungle. But I'd prefer not to. Daylight makes everything easier. Quartz watched him disappear into the vegetation. He speaks as if this is routine. As if building shelters on Deathworlds is a common occurrence. For humans, perhaps it is. Scale said thoughtfully. The reptilian knelt and picked up a flat stone, examining it. They did not evolve in safety. They evolved fighting for every day of survival. That is terrifying, Chirrut said. Yes, Scale agreed. But right now it is also useful. The 3 aliens began collecting stones, their movements awkward and uncertain. Somewhere in the jungle, David was gathering more materials, his humanity making possible what their advanced civilizations never taught them. The basics of survival. The jungle closed around David like a fist. Vegetation pressed in from every side, thick and tangled and alive in ways that made the hair on his arms stand up. Most people would have been terrified. David felt oddly calm. Dangerous places made sense to him in a way that safe ones never quite did. He moved carefully, testing each step before committing his full weight. The ground was soft here, covered in layers of decomposing plant matter. Good for his purposes. It meant rich soil, which meant strong root systems, which meant stable trees. He needed those trees for the support beams. A sound made him freeze. Something was moving through the undergrowth to his left. Something big. David's hand went to his belt knife, though he knew it would be useless against anything truly dangerous. The sound came closer, branches snapping under considerable weight. Then he saw it. The creature stood nearly 3 meters tall, covered in scales that shifted color to match the surrounding foliage. 6 legs, each ending in claws that could easily disembowel him. A head that was mostly mouth, full of teeth designed for tearing meat. It looked at David with eyes that held predatory intelligence. David went very still. His heart rate spiked, but he controlled his breathing, keeping it slow and steady. Predators were predators, earthborn or otherwise. They reacted to certain behaviors. Running triggered chase instincts. Aggression triggered defensive responses. But calm stillness sometimes confused them. The creature took a step closer, its head lowering to bring those eyes level with David's face. He could smell it now. a musky scent mixed with the copper tang of old blood. Its nostrils flared, taking in his scent. David watched its body language, looking for the telltale signs that preceded an attack. Tensing muscles, shifting weight, flattening ears, or raising spines, but the creature just studied him. Its head tilted slightly, almost like curiosity. David realized what was happening. He didn't smell like prey. Humans had an odor that confused many predators on Earth. Something about their diet and sweat composition. Maybe the same was true here. Maybe he smelled like something inedible or dangerous. Slowly, carefully, David raised his hands to shoulder height, palms forward, a universal gesture that said he was no threat but also not helpless. The creature's eyes tracked the movement. Then, after what felt like an hour but was probably only 30 seconds, it turned and walked away. The jungle swallowed it as completely as if it had never existed. David let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. His hands were shaking slightly. He gave himself a moment to let the adrenaline drain, then continued his work. He found what he needed deeper in the forest. Trees with straight trunks and wood that was hard but not brittle. He tested several by pressing his thumbnail into the bark. Too soft and they would collapse under weight. Too hard and they would snap in strong winds. He needed that middle ground, that perfect balance. When he found the right tree, he studied it for several minutes before making the first cut. His small knife wasn't ideal for woodworking, but it would have to do. He started cutting branches that had already fallen, selecting pieces about 2 meters long and as thick as his forearm. Each cut took time, the blade working through alien wood fiber by fiber. By the time he had collected enough branches, his arms ached and his shirt was soaked through with sweat. But he was smiling. This would work. The wood was strong enough, light enough, and plentiful enough. He bundled the branches together using vine strips, creating a load he could carry on his shoulder. The walk back to the clearing was harder. The bundle was awkward and heavy. The jungle seemed determined to trip him with roots and tangle him with hanging vines. But David had carried firewood through worse terrain. He adjusted his grip, found his balance, and pushed through. When he emerged into the clearing, the 3 aliens looked up from their stone pile with expressions he was starting to recognize. That particular mix of confusion and amazement that meant they couldn't quite believe what they were seeing. "You survived," Quartz said, and there was genuine surprise in the crystalline voice. "Of course I survived." David dropped his bundle next to the materials he'd gathered earlier. "I've been walking around for an hour, not fighting a war." "You were gone for 73 minutes, Quartz corrected. "I calculated a 67% chance you would encounter lethal fauna." "I did." David pulled out his water container and took a long drink. "Big thing, lots of teeth." It decided I wasn't worth the trouble. Chiric's clicking intensified to a frantic pitch. "A predator approached you and you survived by not being worth eating?" "More or less." David examined the stone pile the aliens had created. They'd done good work, collecting flat pieces that would stack well. "This is perfect." "Good job." Scale stood straighter at the praise, though he tried to hide it. "What did you fight it with?" "Your blade?" "Didn't fight it." David started sorting his new materials. "Fighting is a last resort. Takes too much energy, too much risk. Better to avoid conflict when possible. But you are human." Scale's confusion was obvious. "Your species is known for aggression, for facing threats directly. We're also known for survival." David picked up one of the longer branches, testing its weight and balance. "And you don't survive by picking fights you don't need to win. You survive by knowing when to fight and when to simply exist in the same space as something dangerous." He looked at the 3 aliens, seeing their exhaustion and fear. Most species in the galaxy evolved in safe places. You had time to develop technology because you didn't spend every day fighting to survive. Humans didn't have that luxury. Earth killed us for thousands of years before we figured out how to kill it back. "That is a dark way to view your homeworld," Quartz said quietly. "Maybe." David shrugged. "But it's also why I can do this." He gestured to the materials spread around them. "Why I know how to read an ecosystem, how to identify useful plants, how to convince a predator I'm not food. These aren't special skills. They're just human baseline." "If this is your baseline," Chirric said, "I am beginning to understand why the galaxy finds humans so disturbing." David laughed. "Wait until you see what else I can do. I still need to make 2 more trips for materials. Then we build." He headed back toward the jungle, leaving 3 aliens to contemplate the uncomfortable truth. Humanity's greatest strength wasn't technology or intelligence or cooperation. It was the simple, terrifying fact that they had learned to thrive in conditions that would kill almost anyone else. David disappeared into the vegetation again, and this time the aliens didn't worry quite as much. They were starting to understand something important. On this Deathworld, among all the dangerous and lethal things that lived here, the human might be the most dangerous of all, not because of violence, but because nothing here could stop him from doing exactly what he intended to do. David knelt in the dirt, his hands moving over the stones like he was reading something written in their surfaces. The sun had passed its highest point and was beginning its slow descent toward the horizon. 4 hours until darkness, maybe less. He needed to work faster. Here, he said, pointing to a spot about 5 meters from the damaged pod. This is where we build. Scale approached cautiously. Why this location specifically? Look at the ground. David brushed away loose soil, revealing harder earth underneath. This spot is elevated slightly. Water will drain away from it, not pool underneath. See how that tree line curves? It'll block wind from the north. And we have clear sight lines in 3 directions. If something approaches, we'll see it coming. Chirrut made a clicking sound that might have been impressed. You determined all of this by looking? And feeling. And thinking about what happens when it rains. David started placing stones in a rough rectangle, testing different arrangements. Shelter isn't just about having walls and a roof. It's about location, drainage, airflow, visibility. Get those wrong and you might as well sleep in the open. He worked methodically, fitting stones together like a puzzle. Each piece had to sit flat against its neighbors, creating a stable foundation. No mortar, no adhesive, just careful placement and gravity. The aliens watched in silence as the border took shape. May I help? The question came from Scale, hesitant and uncertain. David looked up, surprised. Sure, see these smaller stones? I need them to fill the gaps between the larger ones. Makes the foundation more stable. Scale picked up a stone and held it awkwardly, clearly unsure how to proceed. David guided the reptilian's hands, showing where the stone should go and how to wedge it tight. Like that. You've got it? Something changed in Scale's expression. Pride, maybe. Or purpose. The reptilian started searching for more gap-filling stones, working alongside David with increasing confidence. Quartz moved closer to observe. I am calculating the structural integrity of this foundation. The weight distribution is surprisingly optimal. Thousands of years of trial and error, David said, placing another stone. Humans have been stacking rocks since before we had language. We know what works. The foundation took an hour to complete. When David stood back to examine it, he felt satisfied. The rectangle was large enough for 4 people to sleep comfortably, elevated enough to stay dry, and stable enough to support whatever structure he built on top. Now came the harder part. David selected his longest, straightest branches and began working them into the ground around the foundation's perimeter. Each one had to go deep enough to stay anchored, but not so deep that it would snap under stress. He used a flat stone as a hammer, driving each branch into the earth with careful strikes. What are you building? Chirrut asked. The shape is unclear. Framework first, David explained. These vertical poles will support the walls and roof. Once they're secure, I'll add horizontal supports, then weave the walls between them. Weave? Quartz's tone suggested the word didn't translate well. As in textile production? Same principle, different materials. David lashed 2 branches together using his prepared vine strips. His fingers moved quickly, the knots tight and even. You take flexible material and pass it over and under rigid supports. Creates a strong, stable surface. He worked his way around the perimeter, creating a skeleton of vertical and horizontal branches. The structure began to take shape. No longer just random sticks, but the clear outline of something intentional. Something that could be called a building. This is remarkable. Quartz had moved even closer, studying the lashing technique. You are using principles of tensile strength and load distribution without any calculations. Don't need calculations. David tied off another knot. I can feel when something's right or wrong. Too loose and it sways. Too tight and it might snap. There's a sweet spot in the middle where everything just holds together properly. Intuitive engineering, Quartz said softly. We lost this when we developed computational design. We forgot that structures can be felt, not just calculated. David smiled. Nothing wrong with computers. But sometimes your hands know things your brain doesn't. He showed Chirrut how to help. The insectoid's multiple limbs actually making them ideal for holding materials in place while David worked. They developed a rhythm, Chirrut positioning branches while David secured them. Scale continued working on the foundation, adding more stones to increase stability. The walls came next. David had gathered armfuls of flexible branches and broad leaves. He began weaving them between the vertical supports over and under, creating a tight lattice. His hands moved automatically, muscle memory from childhood projects translating to alien materials. "Why the pattern?" Scale asked, watching the weave take shape. "Why not simply stack the materials?" "Weaving distributes force across multiple points," David explained, not slowing his work. "One branch might break, but the pattern holds everything else in place. It's stronger than the sum of its parts." The sun touched the horizon as David finished the walls. 3 sides were complete, woven tight enough to block wind and rain. The 4th side faced away from the prevailing wind direction and had a wide opening for entry. Now the roof. David's hands were starting to blister, but he ignored the pain. This is the most important part. Get it wrong and everything else is useless. He'd saved his largest leaves and strongest branches for this. The roof needed to shed water, support its own weight, and stay attached in strong winds. He constructed it on the ground first, weaving a thick mat of leaves layered like scales on a fish. Each layer overlapped the one below, channeling water downward. Fascinating. Quartz touched the leaf mat gently. This mimics biological designs found across hundreds of species. Scales, feathers, tree bark, all evolved to shed water efficiently. "Nature's a good teacher," David said. "No point reinventing what already works." With help from all 3 aliens, they lifted the roof structure onto the framework. David lashed it securely, testing its stability by pulling hard on different sections. It held firm. Rain would run off the sloped surface, draining away from the walls and foundation. He stepped back, his whole body aching. The shelter stood complete in the dying light. Not fancy, not comfortable by galactic standards, but solid, functional, built entirely by hand from materials that had been growing wild an hour ago. "It is done?" Chirrut asked quietly. "Almost." David pulled out his clay, mixed it with water and plant fibers to make a thick paste, and began coating the walls. "This seals gaps and adds insulation. Once it dries, we'll have proper walls." He worked until darkness made seeing difficult. The clay coating was rough but complete. Inside the shelter, David had created raised platforms using smaller branches lashed together. Beds, basically, 4 of them. There. David sat down heavily on one platform, testing it. It held his weight without complaint. "This is home until rescue arrives." The 3 aliens stood at the entrance, staring at what had been empty ground just hours ago. Now a building stood there, created without machines or power tools or advanced materials, created the way humans had built things for thousands of years, with knowledge, skill, and hands that refused to give up. "Come on," David said. "Let's sleep inside. Tomorrow I'll work on improvements." "Improvements?" Scale's voice held disbelief. "You consider this incomplete?" David smiled in the darkness. "There's always room for improvement." Darkness brought sounds. Things moved through the jungle that had stayed hidden during daylight hours, their calls echoing across the clearing in tones that ranged from musical to threatening. David lay on his platform inside the shelter, listening and categorizing. That sound was probably something flying. That one came from something big moving through undergrowth. That one was definitely a warning call. Next to him, Chirrut's clicking had taken on a rhythmic quality that suggested sleep, though David wasn't sure if insects actually slept the way mammals did. Across the shelter, Scale's breathing was slow and steady. Only Quartz seemed awake, the crystalline alien's body giving off a faint glow in the darkness. "You are not concerned about the sounds?" Quartz asked quietly. "Concerned, yes. Panicking, no." David adjusted his position on the platform. "Animals make noise for lots of reasons. Territory marking, mating calls, warning others about danger. Most of it isn't about us." "Most," Quartz repeated. "But not all." "Not all," David agreed. "But we're inside, elevated off the ground, and the structure we built today will hide our scent to some degree. We're probably safer than we would be in the pod." As if to prove a point, a groan of tortured metal echoed from the pod. More structural failure. David heard something settling, shifting. The pod wouldn't last much longer. Thunder rumbled in the distance. David sat up, instantly alert. "Storm coming. How can you tell?" Scale was awake now too, his voice sharp with sudden fear. "Feel the air. It's heavier, more humid. And smell that? Rain on the way, maybe 10 minutes out." David moved to the shelter's entrance, looking up at the sky. Clouds covered the stars, thick and dark. This is going to be a big one. The shelter will not hold, Chirik said, clicking frantically. We built it in hours. It cannot withstand a storm. It'll hold. David's voice was calm, confident. I designed it for this. The roof angle sheds water. The walls are flexible enough to bend with wind, and the foundation is solid. Trust me, the first drops hit like thrown pebbles. Within seconds, the sky opened up completely. Rain poured down in sheets so thick David couldn't see the pod anymore, though it was only a few meters away. Wind roared through the clearing, bending trees and tearing at vegetation. Inside the shelter, it was dry. Water ran off the leaf roof exactly as David had designed, channeling down the sides and away from the foundation. A few drops made it through gaps in the weaving, but nothing serious. The structure swayed slightly in the wind gusts, but the flexibility kept it from breaking. It holds, Quartz said, wonder clear in the chiming voice. Against all probability, it holds. Lightning split the sky, bright enough to see through the woven walls. In that flash of illumination, David saw shapes moving around the clearing's edge. Large shapes drawn by the storm or perhaps investigating the strange new structure that had appeared in their territory. Thunder followed immediately, close enough to feel in his chest. The predators at the clearing's edge scattered, spooked by the sound. David relaxed slightly. Even apex predators feared storms. Are we safe? Chirik asked. The insectoid had moved to the center of the shelter, as far from the walls as possible. Safe as we can be. David returned to his platform. The lightning likes tall objects. We're shorter than the surrounding trees, so we should be fine. And the elevated foundation means flooding won't reach us. Should be fine, Scale repeated. Those words do not inspire confidence. Nothing's certain in survival situations. David lay back down, using his wadded jacket as a pillow. You make the best decisions you can with available information and hope mathematics favors you. The storm raged for hours. Wind howled, rain hammered, thunder shook the ground. But inside David's shelter, 4 survivors stayed dry and relatively comfortable. The structure he'd built in a single afternoon withstood forces that were tearing apart the high-tech escape pod outside. Somewhere around midnight, the pod gave up completely. A final groan of failing metal, then a crash that even the storm couldn't hide. David heard it but didn't get up to look. There was nothing to see and nothing he could do. The pod was dead. They were committed now to staying in the shelter until rescue. As if understanding this, Quartz began to glow brighter. Not much, just enough to push back the darkness slightly. I do not require sleep as you understand it, the crystalline alien said. I can provide light while you rest. Thank you. David was surprised by the gesture. Quartz had been the most skeptical about the shelter plan. Wake me if anything changes. He closed his eyes, letting the sound of rain on leaves lull him toward sleep. Behind his eyelids, he saw the shelter's construction again, each step and decision. He'd done good work today. Not perfect, but good enough. Sometimes good enough was all you needed. The storm passed before dawn. David woke to quiet, the kind that felt heavy after so much noise. He sat up and immediately went to check the shelter. A few branches had loosened in the wind. Some of the clay coating had washed away in spots, but the structure stood intact, completely functional. Outside, the clearing looked different. The storm had torn down branches and scattered debris everywhere. Water pooled in low spots, turning parts of the ground to mud. And the pod, David saw with grim satisfaction, had collapsed completely. The hull was crumpled like paper, the interior exposed to the elements. We would have died in there, Scale said, coming to stand beside David. The reptilian was looking at the destroyed pod with something like horror. If we had stayed as I suggested, the storm would have killed us. Maybe. David examined the damage objectively. Hard to say for certain. But yeah, probably. You knew. It wasn't a question. When you insisted on building the shelter, you knew the pod would fail. I suspected. David started gathering branches that had fallen during the storm. Waste not, want not. Metal fails in predictable ways. The crash damage compromised structural integrity. Add weather stress and it was only a matter of time. Chirik emerged from the shelter, clicking softly. You saved us. I built a shelter, David corrected. Same thing humans have been doing since we learned to stack rocks. Nothing special about it. To you, perhaps. Quartz followed Chirik out, the crystalline body reflecting the dawn light. But to us this is extraordinary. You created safety from nothing, using only knowledge and physical effort. Our civilizations lost this ability generations ago. David shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. You want to help with breakfast? I saw some fruits yesterday that might be edible. Need to test them properly, but we should start building a food supply. You are thinking about food? Scale sounded incredulous. We nearly died last night and you are thinking about breakfast? We didn't die. Now we need to eat. David started walking toward the jungle, then stopped and looked back at the three aliens. Coming? I'll teach you how to identify safe foods. They followed because what else could they do? The human had proven himself right about everything so far. The shelter stood while technology failed. The simple knowledge of how to build with hands and natural materials had saved their lives. As they walked into the jungle, Quartz spoke quietly to Scale. I am beginning to understand something troubling about humans. What is that? They are only considered strange because they remember what most species forgot. They are not special. They are simply unbroken. Scale looked at David, watching the human examine plants with patient care. Then perhaps, the reptilian said slowly, the rest of us are the broken ones. Neither alien had an answer to that. They simply followed David deeper into the jungle, ready to learn the oldest lessons in the galaxy. How to survive with nothing but skill and determination. 3 days had changed everything. The clearing that once held only a crashed pod and frightened survivors now looked almost like a small village. David had expanded the original shelter, adding a covered area for food preparation and a separate section for storing materials. Water collection systems made from hollowed branches caught rain and channeled it into containers they'd fashioned from the pod's non-structural components. A fire pit sat in the center of everything, ringed with stones and equipped with a ventilation system that David had engineered using clay channels. The three aliens had changed too. Scale no longer moved with the uncertainty of someone lost. The reptilian carried firewood with confidence, arranged stones with purpose, and had even begun suggesting improvements to David's designs. Shirik's clicking had lost its panicked edge, replaced by focused attention to detail. The insectoid had discovered a talent for weaving, creating repairs to the shelter walls that were tighter and neater than David's own work. Quartz had transformed the most. The crystalline alien now spent hours studying everything David did, asking questions not from fear but from genuine curiosity. Together they had cataloged 17 edible plant species, mapped water sources within a kilometer, and identified the territories of the clearing's major predators. David was showing Scale how to start a fire without matches when they heard it. A sound that didn't belong to the jungle, a sound that was mechanical, artificial, and getting closer. Rescue, Chirik said, the clicking rapid with excitement. The rescue ship has found us. They all moved to the clearing's edge, looking up. A ship descended through the canopy, sleek and silver and completely at odds with the natural world around them. It landed with hardly a sound, its hull pristine and perfect. A door opened, a ramp extended, and figures began descending. The captain was a Velen like Quartz, but larger and clearly older. The crystalline body held patterns of age and experience. Behind the captain came crew members of various species, all wearing environment suits despite the perfectly breathable atmosphere. Survivors of the Meridian Trader? The captain's voice was formal, professional. I am Captain Crystal of the rescue vessel Sanctuary. We received your distress signal and have come to retrieve you. We are here, Quartz called out, leading the group forward. All 4 of us alive and well. Crystal's body flickered with what might have been surprise. All 4? Our projection suggested significant casualties in a Class 7 environment. The captain's gaze moved past them to the shelter complex behind them. What is that structure? Shelter, David said simply. Built it when we crashed. Built it. Crystal approached the shelter slowly, examining it from every angle. This was constructed on a Deathworld using primitive materials? Not primitive, David corrected gently. Natural. There's a difference. The captain reached out to touch the woven walls, then the clay coating, then the intricate roof structure. Impossible. The engineering required for this, the knowledge of materials and structural integrity. You accomplished this in 3 days? Built the main shelter the first day, David said. The rest came after. Improvements, additions, refinements. Would have done more, but we were limited on time. Crystal turned to face David fully, and the intensity in those crystalline features was almost uncomfortable. You are the human? David Reed, cargo specialist. You built this? It wasn't really a question. With no tools, no technology, no assistance beyond 3 individuals from species that have no survival training. They learned fast. David gestured to his companions. Scale's got good instincts for structure. Chirik has incredibly steady hands. Quartz has been documenting everything, which will be useful for others. Documenting? Crystal made a sound like wind chimes in a storm. You are telling me there is documentation of this process? Quartz stepped forward. Comprehensive documentation, material selection criteria, construction techniques, environmental assessment protocols, everything. I have recorded 17 hours of detailed observations. Crystal went very still. When the captain spoke again, the voice was different, charged with emotion. Do you understand what you have accomplished? Most species would have died here. Those that survived would have huddled in their failing technology, waiting for rescue or death. But you built, you thrived. You taught species from advanced civilizations how to survive as your ancestors did. I built a shelter, David said, confused by the reaction. It's not that special. It is that special. Crystal turned to the crew. Secure this structure. I want engineers to document every aspect of its construction. This shelter is to be preserved and studied. Preserved? Scale looked between the captain and David. Why? Because it represents something we lost. Crystal moved through the camp, examining the fire pit, the water collection system, the food storage. Our species became spacefaring and left behind the fundamental skills that allowed us to survive in the first place. We became dependent on technology, on artificial environments, on tools that do our thinking for us. The captain picked up one of David's hand-shaped tools, a stone blade he'd made by napping. This is not primitive technology. This is foundational technology. This is the beginning of everything we built on top of it, and we forgot how to do it. You want to learn? David asked, genuinely surprised. I want the galaxy to learn. Crystal fixed him with an intense gaze. David Reed, I am authorized to offer you a position with the Galactic Emergency Response Council. Your task would be to teach survival techniques to response teams across all member species. David blinked. You want me to teach people how to build shelters? I want you to teach them how to survive when technology fails, how to read environments, assess resources, construct solutions from nothing but knowledge and effort. Crystal gestured to the 3 aliens. You did not just build a shelter. You gave these individuals skills they can carry forward. You taught them to be self-reliant. It is true, Quartz said quietly. I understand ecosystems now in ways I never did when I relied on scanners. I can identify patterns, predict behaviors, recognize danger, not because of technology, but because I learned to observe properly. I am not afraid anymore, Chirik added. Before, when separated from my hive, I felt helpless. Now I know I can survive alone if necessary. That knowledge changes everything. Scale stepped forward. My people pride themselves on warrior traditions. But we had forgotten that survival is the first battle. You reminded us that strength without knowledge is useless. David looked at his 3 companions, seeing the changes in them clearly now. And they stood differently, moved with confidence instead of fear. They had learned something that went beyond simple survival skills. I will accept, David said to Crystal, on one condition. Name it. These 3 come with me as teaching assistants. They learned from scratch, which means they can explain things to others who are learning from scratch. I understand this stuff instinctively, but they had to think through every step. Crystal's body shimmered with approval. Agreed. You will all be part of the program. The crew began preparing for departure, but David noticed they were careful not to disturb the shelter. Several were taking detailed scans and measurements. One was sketching the structure by hand, which David found oddly touching. One more thing, Crystal said as they prepared to board. This planet will be designated as a training site. Your shelter will become a teaching monument. Emergency supply caches will be placed nearby. But any team that trains here will first be required to build their own shelter using only natural materials. They will learn as you taught. David looked back at the structure he'd built in desperation 3 days ago. It had saved 4 lives. Now it would teach countless others. Something about that felt right, felt important in ways he couldn't quite explain. Thank you, he said simply. No, Crystal replied. Thank you. You reminded us of something we had nearly forgotten. That intelligence without practical knowledge is incomplete. That technology without foundational skills is fragile. That survival is not about having the best tools, but about knowing how to create tools from nothing. They boarded the ship, As it lifted off, David watched the clearing disappear below them. The shelter stood in the center of it all, simple and strong and completely functional, a testament to what hands and knowledge could accomplish. "Do you think they will learn?" Scale asked, standing beside him at the window. "Some will," David said. "Some won't, but the ones who do will be better for it. They'll understand that you don't need advanced technology to survive. You just need to remember what your ancestors knew." "What did they know?" Chirrut asked. David smiled. "That the universe doesn't care about your technology or your civilization or your pride. It only cares if you can adapt, if you can learn, if you can build something better than what you started with. That's true whether you're using rocks and sticks or fusion reactors and quantum computers." "Philosophy from a shelter builder," Quartz said, and there was warmth in the chiming voice. "You are full of surprises, David Reed." "Not really," David replied, watching the planet fade behind them. "I'm just human. We've been surprising the universe for as long as we've been leaving our homeworld." The ship jumped to faster-than-light travel, carrying 4 survivors and one simple truth: that sometimes the oldest knowledge is the most valuable, and the most basic skills are the ones that save lives when everything else fails. Behind them on a Deathworld clearing, a shelter stood empty but not abandoned. It waited for the next students, ready to teach the oldest lesson in the galaxy: how to survive with nothing but your hands and your mind.